is one of my colleagues at Yale. So when I was doing my PhD, Liz was a master's student. And back then, she was one of the first people working on payment for environmental services. And back in the day where this was a new topic. And it's very interesting to engage with Liz in such a different way and to see her again and exchange ideas. My talk is going to be very informal today. I'll be focusing more, and I asked Rachel what should be talking about. I'm talking much more about my current work at Rainforest Foundation. Actually, what is Rainforest Foundation from the NGO perspective, from the practical aspects of really trying to do conservation on the ground. But I'll be happy to answer any questions about anything else that I did before or some kind of insights you would be curious. I think we have a kind of question and answer thing later, but I'll be happy to answer any questions about anything I could speak. But let me just introduce myself. I'm also originally from Brazil. I have worked and lived in the Brazilian Amazon for 23 years. That kind of dates a little bit how old I am. But I started as an undergrad. It's actually one of my passions. I'm not originally from the Amazon, but I come from a different jungle, which is São Paulo City. It's an urban jungle. But anyway, I was always fascinated by the Amazon, and I can talk a little bit about how being a biologist and being a botanist, I used to do taxonomy for 5 years. Now I'm working with something very different, and I can talk a little bit about how career routes and different options you make too. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here today. I will start by using a quote that's actually not our quote, and I'm sure all of you, for different reasons, everybody who's here probably understands the importance of the rainforests for cooling our planet, for rainforest patterns, for producing oxygen. But one thing that rainforests are very, very important is for the relationship that this ecosystem has with the people. There's like more than 1.5 billion people who actually depend directly or indirectly from forest resources. This is a quote from the World Bank, and it's actually a little outdated. I'm sure these numbers would be even higher by now. Let me talk a little bit about this organization that I work for. Rainforest Foundation was founded by Sting, Sting, from and his wife, Trudy Styler, in 1989. And it was pretty interesting. Sting was doing a series of rock concerts sponsored by Amnesty International. And in those series of international concerts, he met an indigenous leader, a Brazilian indigenous leader called Kayapó indigenous leader, Raoni, who actually told them that he was going through a struggle of trying to demarcate his land in Brazil, and didn't have the support of the government. And then it was pretty interesting because he's a singer, he's not an ecologist, he wasn't doing any kind of master's degree or PhD in environmental conservation, and he kind of had a feeling back then that this could be an interesting thing that he could be supporting, and maybe the forest would be better in the hands of people who are actually already living there. So maybe supporting any kind of efforts to make sure that these people had their rights to their forest insured would be a good strategy to do. So for more than 10 years, he worked, I think but the Rainforest Foundation team worked mainly in Brazil with the Kayapó and with other indigenous organizations it was the first privately demarcation of indigenous land. We're talking about 6.3 million hectares in the Brazilian Amazon. And it set a very important precedent for all the demarcations and also for the government to continue this kind of process. So the Rainforest Foundation now is 23 years old, and currently there are 4 Rainforest Foundations or sister organizations. There's Rainforest Foundation US, Rainforest Foundation UK, Rainforest Foundation Norway, and the Rainforest Fund. Rainforest Foundation US, we all share the same mission, and I'm going to talk about our mission pretty soon. But we are 4 independent organizations with different budgets, with different executive directors, but we collaborate a lot. So Rainforest Foundation US, we work a lot in the Amazon basin, not as much now, but in the past. Central America. Rainforest Foundation UK works primarily in Africa, and Rainforest Foundation Norway has a lot of Norwegian funding. They're the biggest of all, and they work in actually Asia, Africa, and Amazon basin as well. So we share, and in places there's only one country that the 3 Rainforest Foundations work, which is Peru. And then in places where we work or issues that we work collaboratively, we try to interact as much as we can. But we are completely independent. Collectively, we work in 20 different countries, and so far we have helped protect and demarcate 28 million acres of forest. Our mission, don't expect you to be reading, or it's a very verbose mission, but it's basically making sure Indigenous peoples have their rights secure for their land and their resources. And you can go to the website and look a little bit more in detail what the true message is. Our office focuses on 3 different approaches. I mean, what does mean securing rights to land and to resources? Is kind of vague and very inclusive mission and concept. We went through, and I talk a little bit throughout our talk about a process of rethinking of our strategy as an organization in 2010 when I started working there. So I have been working there for only 3 years. And then we decided, I'm going to explain a little bit that I think Rachel mentioned that would be interesting, why we set some priorities in terms of geographic areas and in themes. So the things that we thought we could be working and we would be more effective working is in 3 of them. Securing their rights to their land and to their resources. If you ask any Indigenous groups, and I'm going to say this, it's the #1 priority. And influencing laws and policies that affect a lot of Indigenous access to those resources. And in that particular case, we focus a lot on RED. As you can imagine, RED is becoming a more and more issue that touches a lot of the Indigenous groups, but also we work a lot on oil exploration in Peru, and I can talk a little bit about that as well. And also, I was just talking our coffee hour for the ones who were there during lunchtime. Another very important component of long-term and sustaining any kind of gains or successes you have is only if you have very strong Indigenous organizations on the ground. What we call capacity building, community strengthening organizations. It's not a very sexy topic. Funders are completely turned down from this idea of funding this these days. They used to be very into that kind of decades ago, but it's a thing that we believe if you don't build that, there's no successes or victories that can be sustained in the longer term. And I can explain later what this means for us on the ground. So what we do as an organization, what we say, we take the rights-based approach to forest conservation. So it's the idea that you have to, a good way to protect the forest is by securing the rights that they have to the land and resources that I explained before. And what this approach is all about, I could give you a lecture, a 1-hour lecture of all the different facets of that. But I think it's just important to remember that it's the idea about human rights principles and guidelines, but also more important in this case, Indigenous rights, guide our decision makings in terms of supporting projects and working on projects on the ground. From the design, from thinking about what projects should be supported, how projects are implemented, and then an evaluation of them. And then the idea that there are some international instruments. I'm going to talk only about one today, which I think it's one of the most important ones. I'll be happy to talk about other ones. But how different declarations, treaties, or conventions that are being created at the international level affect and support this kind of Indigenous rights. And then I think it's one of the things that sets us apart from most of environmental organizations that work in the tropics, is that all our proposals, the projects we fund and our actions are completely guided by our partners' needs and priorities. So we don't set the agenda for anyone. We not only think that philosophically it's important to support Indigenous rights, but more and more, when this team created Rainforest Foundation in the late 80s, I mean, probably some of you were in diapers, some of you weren't even born, but this whole idea that community forestry or community could manage resources and they could actually be effective, especially Indigenous groups, was pretty new at that time. It's like the beginning of a lot of data on ethnobotanical research that bring a lot of that. But still, there is new data that reinforces that this rights-based approach to conservation is something actually effective. And I'm decided to give you 3 very different examples from 3 different studies. I don't have time to be updated to my literature these days, but at least those are some of the things that we read. So C4 had a study last year. I don't know if you guys have been familiar with that, but they came out with the idea that areas in which you had community management forests had lower rates of deforestation than other kind of protected areas that had no people living in there. There's also a very interesting study by Nelson Schommitz. There were 2 economists from the World Bank who used forest fires as a proxy for deforestation in their study. And then they found out that in protected areas, in this case, actually, the higher the percentages, the better, because it's reducing forest fires. So they saw that actually indigenous areas were kind of very good indicator of inhibiting forest fires in some other areas when compared to protected areas, which is a way that's showing that is a more best or better effective tool for conservation. And then very recently, IUCN just, I think a couple months ago, just released their Protected Planet report. And one of the headlines is exactly that. In an assessment of what's happening with protected areas worldwide, are the ones who are managed by people, or in the categories in which people live and are part of that, are the ones who are better conserved. So these are not my words. This is there. There's plenty of data and people who disagree, but that's kind of the philosophy and some of the ideas that we follow. I'll give you now 2 examples from places in which we have worked or we work currently to kind of show kind of graphically what we mean by that. So the first one comes from the Brazilian Amazon. This is an average of deforestation because it's in the mid-2000s, so it's how much of deforestation rates you have outside protected areas, within state protected reserves, federal reserves, and indigenous territories, and by far indigenous territories are the ones who have the least amount of deforestation, and it still is the case. I don't know how many of you know the Xingu and the Kayapó and the Parque Nacional do Xingu, the indigenous national park in Xingu area, but this is the Xingu watershed, which is a big river. There's a lot of it in use because of the Belo Monte Dam. We can even talk about that too. And actually Sting had a very important role with that in the beginning of the 90s in kind of, not Sting per se, but Rainforest Foundation in stopping the previous reincarnation of Belo Monte. But anyway, so this is, you're gonna see here, like right in the middle of the watershed is where the Xingu National Park is, and this is a satellite image from 1994. This is from 2005, and I don't have another one, but it's pretty clear and obvious and visual where the indigenous park is. And that we are talking about a place, these people are really at the eye of the hurricane, and this is really what's happening. Is the Mato Grosso state where you have the expansion of soybean plantations, cattle ranching, and this is an amazing story about how these people were able to maintain the territory despite of all the pressures that are happening outside. Is this effective if there's just this piece of land, which actually is millions of hectares, but it's a whole nother discussion if it's just isolated, but it's pretty obvious and visually how this is an example when this worked. And another example comes from Panama, where Rachel spent her summer working with us, which is a more recent program that we've been supporting. We don't work in the Xingu area anymore, and I can explain why there are lots of Brazilian organizations now that work at the Xingu, and we had to think through our strategic planning, but a lot of things is where does it make most sense for us to be in terms of organization, what's our added value. If you have very strong and good NGOs in Brazil working with indigenous issues, what we need to be there. Maybe there's a reason, but we decided to kind of pull out. There's a lot of very competent organizations doing their work there, which is hopefully what we'd like to do from other places as well. So this is a picture of Panama. Panama is kind of interesting country that runs kind of east-west. It's kind of twisted in the middle. But this area here, this is called the Darien region. And it's pretty interesting because you have the Pan American highway that kind of comes here and then it stops. And you have what they call the Darien Gap, which is there's no highway here between Colombia and Panama, so you cannot drive all the way from the States to South America because of this gap. And what you would see here, that's the first covered in 1992. The areas in blue are the indigenous territories. Panama has two kind of indigenous territories types. One is the comarcas, which are extended indigenous areas. This is like a comarca, for example. This is another comarca. So the big patches that you're going to see tends to be kind of comarcas which are independent from the government. They receive funding from governmental agencies to be ran. So it's an interesting design. However, and I will talk later, the government has created new, but when they created the comarcas in Panama, a lot of the indigenous peoples, actually most of them, were outside of the area. So rather than creating a huge indigenous reserve in the whole Darien area, which the government didn't want to do, or even larger ones, so several other indigenous groups were left outside without any kind of protection. So the smaller ones here are what we call the collective lands, and which are the new kind of type of indigenous areas that we're trying to get demarcated in Panama. And one of the Rachel's worked with someone to travel to 5 out of this 27 indigenous collective lands we have there. So just keep your eye on the green. The green is forest cover. The blue is indigenous territories. And then you see this in, did it change? Yeah. 1992, in 2000, and then you can see in 2008. And it's pretty obvious also that the little left, especially in the Darien region, is in indigenous areas. So this is actually some data from a PhD student from McGill University from Canada. And he actually calculated that about 1/3 of Panama is indigenous lands, either recognized officially or claimed by indigenous peoples. And actually about 70% of the forest cover standing is in indigenous areas. So it's an important discussion when you talk about REDD, and Panama is one of the pilot countries for REDD. What does that really mean to engage indigenous peoples or not? So that's just what I just said. So you have a lot of the carbon indigenous peoples, and he come out with the lower deforestation rates in those areas. So these are just two examples, two visual examples on how that works. This is not a lecture on indigenous rights, but I thought it would be nice to give a little bit of a glimpse what I talk about when I talk about indigenous rights. And it's important to understand that it's a set of customs, international norms, conventions, declarations that regulate, and it's very important, the behavior of states and indigenous peoples does not regulate private sector and indigenous peoples. So that's a whole different ballgame. So countries and a different have to sign up into these declarations or these agreements, and I'm going to talk about one of them. They are usually formed over time, and they are based on state practices, and more they're becoming recognized. And I think one of the things that REDD has done is bring to the light to a lot of people some of these indigenous rights. It's actually a very important thing. Today I'm just going to talk about probably the most important international instrument for indigenous peoples, very briefly, which is the UN DRIP, how we call, or is the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's the most comprehensive and the most inclusive sets of rights for indigenous peoples. It was passed through the General Assembly of the United Nations in 2007, after like almost a 30-year of negotiations. It was a very inclusive process in which a lot of indigenous representatives participated in the drafting of this document and in a lot of advocacy to pushing that to happen. Currently, it's signed by every single country in the world. The last one to sign, which country do you believe would be? The United States. Thank God, Obama. If you didn't have a reason to vote for Obama, this is one more. He was the only one who signed up for the, not say what kind of party preference I have, but what kind of, so Canada and US, Australia, before that were the last two countries to sign up for this, and we could discuss why is that. Although it's an interesting and a very important instrument, the tricky thing about the United Declarations, like any declaration, it's not binding. Which means it's not binding, it's not reinforceable. It's not like a contract that you sign and you have to follow. You could ask, so why do people sign for it? It makes you look good in the picture. It looks like your country cares for human rights and for indigenous rights. But although it's not binding, it does carry a lot of moral weight to it. So if a country has signed up for the UN DRIP, in the context of climate change and REDD, it's something, it gives you the leverage to push for a lot of the rights and stuff like that. So just an important thing. The UN DRIP has 42 different articles, and I think just the most important thing to know is that it allows indigenous, has a lot of the rights of self-determination, and how indigenous people should have the rights and the voice to decide how development should take place in the lands and what they want to do and control over any kind of process, and to be able to participate in any decision making that affects their land and their livelihoods. Probably one of the most important articles on this law that I'm sure if you even didn't hear about the declaration, it's not a law, it's a declaration, is FPIC, is the Free, Prior, Informed Consent. It's something that also RED has discussed a lot about that, and Indigenous people bring a lot into the discussion at the international level. I could also go on and on about what it really means in theory, but the idea is that for you to take a decision, like we all do, if someone offers you something, you try to first get informed about what would be the pros and the cons about taking that decision. You would like to think about it before you need to take the decision, so it gives you time, and then you have a balanced information about what's the positive and the negative about that. And it's free, like no one is pressuring you to take a particular decision. So that's very important. And again, it has lots to do with the idea that they control their own future and the future of their people. Just two things. So, as I said, FPIC is part of the UN DRIP, but it was a concept that actually, I'm not going to talk about it much, but the International Labour Organization, the ILO 169, also has some principles on FPIC. But also, I think what's very important that is very not much talked about is that FPIC is not just a box that you check and, okay, done that, been there, did a consultation, now I can go with my project. If I'm like the private sector, I want to explore, or in an indigenous group, or I want to do a RED project or anything like that. It's actually a long-term process, and it's a process that you should have check and balances throughout the time, that not only when you're designing the project, and you want to consult with the communities, but it's a process. It's not a one-time event that takes place at the beginning. It's pretty complex, and actually one of the things I was talking to Liz is, what is free, prior, informed consent? What is adequate consultation for Indigenous peoples? And we can talk more about that. But the idea is that it's a process, and this is a process that not only should happen when you're structuring a project or a kind of intervention that you would like to happen in Indigenous lands, that actually affect Indigenous lands directly or indirectly, and but also the implementation and monitoring and evaluation. Now that you're all very familiar and experts on Indigenous rights, let me go back and talk a little bit about how we work, which I think is also something kind of unique. So we are not, although we have the name Rainforest Foundation, we are not a foundation like MacArthur, like Moore Foundation or Ford Foundation. We don't have our own resources and funding, so we have to look for funding outside. And as I said, there's a Rainforest Fund. I forgot kind of to explain that, but there are the 3 Rainforest Foundations. The 4th organization is the Rainforest Fund. What happens every 2 years, Sting and his friends perform in Carnegie Hall, Elton John, Lady Gaga, Bruce Springsteen, Bruno Mars. And so people pay to go watch the concert. Some of them also go to the gala dinner afterwards. There's an auction. So all the money fundraising that night goes to the Rainforest Fund, who then every year, the 3 Rainforest Foundations and some other invited organizations apply. So it's not a done deal. We have to apply, and actually they're pretty rigorous selection who gets to do the different projects. So although we have a sort of like a sister organization, we don't have that. Plus, one of the policies of the Rainforest Fund is that 90% of the funding has to go on the ground. So which means we can only account for 10%, which doesn't cover like all our operational costs or salaries or anything like that. Just and another very important thing that we don't work with people for just one particular project for 1 year, for 3 years. What we really try to do is we believe that some of the processes and some of the changes we're trying to bring are very long-term processes. So you kind of need to be hanging on and be together for a much longer time than usual other organizations do. Another thing, as I said, that I think sets us apart from a lot of environmental NGOs, we never set the partners' agenda. What we do is we sit down with them when we decided to choose what kind of partners we're going to do, depending on the funding, depending on the priorities, the geographic priorities, and things like that. And then what we do is like we always sit down and say, what are your guys' priorities? And if someone comes to us and said, oh, we'd like to set up a health post here, it's a very important need, but it's not has anything to do with our mission per se. So then we can't do that. But so we don't set our agenda. We just try to find a common ground between what we can support and help, and what people are interested in helping. So therefore, you have to be very wise in terms of when you choose your partners. And as I said, there is some re-granting that we do. There's some direct funding that we provide to Indigenous peoples, which is very different than a lot of NGOs who, when they're partnering with organizations, I don't know how many of you had this experience, that gives you $1,000 for a workshop, and then gives you $500 for you to go to the city and negotiate with the mayor, but doesn't really allow you to have the funds, and as an organization, learn how to manage these funds and how to be more self-sustained. It is a very complicated issue. It takes much more time to do it, but we believe that it's when you build these relationships and then sustainable organizations is that you actually can bring these successes much longer. So a lot of our work is in building local capacity. And so as I said, we provide directive funding to our partners. Our projects run from, it varies from $50,000 to $150,000 per project per organization, depending what it is, depending what your needs are. They are the ones who set up the activities, the budgets. And actually one really interesting thing that the fund does, the Rainforest Fund does, is that our partners are the ones who actually write the proposals in whatever language they speak. Not the traditional language, but Spanish and Portuguese and English or French. And the chair of the board of the Rainforest Fund can read all these languages, which is something very unique. Usually foundations or any kind of a funding require you to write in English, which is a huge barrier for a lot of organizations to do. So in that case, they can write. So a lot of the work that we do, because it's going to be their proposal that's going to be shown to the fund, rather than we getting the proposal and rewriting or putting it better, we work with them to make it better. So there's more than a month work just going back and forth. Okay, clarify this activity, clarify this objective a little bit better. And which we also believe it's a very important issue to be working with, because hopefully in the future, these people can be applying to other sources of funding that are not us. It's the only way you can do it, that is by going through this process, rather than having me rewrite everything and just show that to them later, having them to go through the process of building their own proposal. So we give direct funding to partners to do legal work, to work on capacity building, technical workshops. There's a lot of things that we fund has to do with Indigenous rights, kind of know your rights workshop, which is something very common. But we also, so we're not just a pass-through or a funder. There's also a lot of things that we do in terms of providing technical knowledge and expertise in a variety of different things. So it could be policy analysis, it could be workshops on climate change. I have been to several of them. We help them, and the project management reporting is another important issue, capacity building, and we also try to connect them with different organizations sometimes. And we have, there is a pro bono legal support. There's an organization based in New York that provides a lot of pro bono support for Indigenous groups or for anyone. The only tricky thing with Indigenous groups is that usually all the issues are issues directly related to government, like exploration, land demarcation, and a lot of law firms don't want to get their hands dirty. So it's one problem that we find sometimes if you're fighting for intellectual property rights or things like that, that seems less messy or diplomatic or things like that, we can get more of a support, but anyway, it's an important thing to do. As I said, we help on, and I'm going to go over each of these different components that we work and just explain a little bit of the challenges that we face when we work on this issue and what we do about it. So securing land rights. As I said, this is, if you ask any Indigenous group who hasn't had their land demarcated, what is your priority? It's going to be their number one priority. I bet with you. There are very few organizations these days that support land demarcation, and a lot of people think land demarcation is kind of thing of the past, that has all been demarcated now. Unfortunately, this is not the truth. I would say that there's a lot of work. For example, in Brazil, I would say 80% of indigenous territories have been recognized legally by the Brazilian government. There are other countries that is not as far along and still have a lot to be done. So we provide legal, technical, procedure challenges on how they can get this. There's lots of challenges. I mean, if you have to follow some kind of regulation and find out what are kind of all the documentation that you need, how to navigate all this bureaucratic system, that's something we help them to do. So we provide them technical support, kind of know your rights workshops, file claims, help to negotiate. We do a lot of negotiation workshops as well. And although it's one of the most important priority, and I'm going to talk about that when I talk about Rainforest Foundation in general, what are the challenges of us choosing rights-based approach and what are the challenges of us choosing these three components. One of the things, this is a very long-term process. Some lands take more than a decade to get demarcated. So, and finding a way that you can find a funder that can maintain you through all this process, it's a very tricky issue. The other one is the influencing policy, is making sure that whatever process is happening that has anything to do with Indigenous peoples' access to their resources, carbon, oil, or anything like that, has their participation and has their voices and their input into that. And what happens is a lot of them sometimes don't have advocacy skills or the negotiation skills you need. So we do a lot of training on Indigenous leaders about climate change, about RED. Actually brought it, I'm going to leave with Liz, but I'll be happy to give it to you, a digital copy. That's a manual, for example, on Indigenous rights and climate change that we tailored for our partners in Guyana. Actually, we did with them. It's a series of different booklets about different aspects of how do you hold a workshop, because it was a trainers of trainers thing. So the idea was to train 25 Indigenous leaders who then could go back to their villages and the regions and kind of repeat the same kind of training rather than having Marina going everywhere in Guyana and doing it, which is not very cost effective and not very empowering from that side. What is climate change and what is RED? What is the international debate about RED? What is in the case of Guyana? Guyana has a low carbon development strategy. It's kind of that has RED as a component. It's kind of their national policy. So it's an evaluation of their national policy. What are the Indigenous rights at the national level? So we analyze their constitution, what in Guyana, and also the international level. And the sixth one is about social safeguards and RED, so something about Indigenous people. So the idea is we're going to be this year replicating this for other countries like Peru and Panama where we work, and hopefully updating them as well. But it's just an example of how we can help them to translate something that is very complicated as RED into something that they can actually understand. And it's, I always remember Liz mentioning when she gave a lecture at Yale FES many years ago about her master's project, that she said about a woman who raised her hand and said, okay, but when is people going to come and harvest the carbon? I countless have heard this question again. And also thinking about when people are presenting in their translation into an Indigenous language in what they're calling consultation processes, the translation of basic concept like greenhouse gases. It gets translated like a house painted in green that keep gases. I mean, they don't know what we mean by greenhouse gases. So it's just examples that it seems pretty obvious, but it's you can only participate actively in something you feel that you understand, unless you're being manipulated. But anyway, so we believe firmly on that, and there's some on our exploration as well that I can talk later. And so that's kind of helping them provide information, translating documents, summarizing information, going to workshops. A lot of our work is actually helping them to go to meetings related to United Nations, based in New York, and other things like that. And then the third component, as I said, is a very long-term processes, very challenging. But as we said, we believe that there is no long-term success or victory that can be sustained if you don't have leaders that care and that are involved with the Indigenous groups, and how you built that and how you built that to last. It's something very important. So we do a lot of workshops in communication skills and advocacy skills, negotiations and reporting and project management, administration, finance, all those different things. And also they are always the ones who decided what kind of training they would like or what kind of issues. As I said, one of the first things that I had on my desk to do with my colleague Christine, when I started working at the Rainforest Foundation, we realized we were working in 6-7 countries. We were supporting all these different initiatives with all different issues, all related with Indigenous peoples, all very important. But one thing, there's a push for NGOs in the US from the donor community to be kind of more and more accountable for what's your impact, what is the measurable outcomes that come out of your process. And so when you're spread out that thin, it's kind of hard for you to say, well, but I worked on that project on that little river there, or I did this thing here. Not something that convinces to tell a cohesive story about what you're doing. So we had then to go to an analysis and figured out what kind of countries we can be working, what kind of countries a small NGO like us can have an added value, and we can help promote some of the changes that we're looking for. So then we thought Peru, Guyana, to a lesser extent Brazil, which is working in the really, really northern part of Brazil, and the Roraima state. Here. And Panama could be interesting. And I'm going to go quickly to the rationale and the sets of criteria that made us make this decision. Because, I mean, this is one of the things that Rachel thought it could be interesting, inside scoop of our decision-making processes. So we had to think, okay, we're only going to work in the Amazon basin in Central America, which are the places that we've been working. So when we are setting up all the three issues that we're going to be working on, we have to think about what are the most relevant ones for Indigenous peoples. Where there's a place that we can do a window of opportunity for change, something that happened in that particular country that would allow us to add to that, but there's some kind of precedence that can be used for models in other places, where we already have partnerships and strong and collaborative partnerships, places in which we had high forest cover, places where we could make a difference. One thing that maybe was written somewhere, but I didn't say, is Rainforest Foundation, also another approach we have. We don't have offices in the countries that we work. We believe that increases greatly the overhead of the organization, and rather than having Marina or Christine in all the countries, having offices in all the countries we live, it's better to support our partners on the ground who are actually going to be there for the longer term to be working on this. So, and then where we could be a player and kind of fill a niche. So we did a lot of rethinking about what other NGOs, international NGOs and national NGOs are working on Indigenous issues in places we have worked and are working, and what kind of niches we could be filling. And we came out with these countries that I was talking to you about, Guyana, and I'll be happy to talk more about any of them in the question and answer time. Guyana has a high forest cover, it's a huge need for demarcation on indigenous lands, has a bilateral agreement with the Norwegian government in terms of a RED bilateral scheme, which is interesting. And we have worked in Guyana for more than 10 years, so it was a place that we felt that we had an important role to play. There are not many organizations that work in Guyana. Actually, even lots of people don't even know where Guyana is. I was talking to some of you during lunchtime how complicated it is and how complex it is to actually fundraise for Guyana, because for some people Guyana is not part of Latin America because they speak English. Guyana is a very corrupted government, and it's very complicated to work there. It's not very, I mean, coming from Brazil where you have this very vibrant and civil society organizations, going to Guyana is kind of the opposite context of that. So how do you navigate and work with there's barely any civil society organization efforts is pretty difficult, but we find that's why we should be there in the first place. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons. Panama had a relatively high forest cover in the places that we wanted to do. It's concentrated in Indigenous peoples. As I said, there was a legal window of opportunity to demarcate new type of Indigenous areas, the collective lands. There were a lot of fights and a lot of mobilization, organization of Indigenous peoples at the national level, and also is a RED country for the UN RED program scheme. Peru, there's so many reasons why you also should be in Peru, which is a lot of them. There was a change of government in Peru. There was what it looked like at the beginning, a much more progressive government, which is turning out not to be that progressive after he took office. But it's a very interesting case because it's one of the first, certainly the first Latin American country to sign up a constitution law. And this constitution law is going to regulation now. It's a long story, but has strong organizations. There's a lot of oil exploration is a major issue. It's also pilot country for RED. And you have to think when you're an NGO in terms of funding, and it would be hard not to fund Peru. In Brazil, I'm not going to. We pulled out of the Xingu area, as I mentioned. There are lots of very competent organizations working there. We're doing a little bit more work with the CIR, which is the Conselho Indígena de Roraima in Brazil. And there's a lot of work. We just won a legal case on a land demarcation there. So as I said, we work on these two different issues, and I'm going to go there into a more talking about our successes and the challenges of working with this kind of approach in a small organization, in an international organization. And so as I said, together we have helped protect 28 million of acres. We won some for anyone who follows indigenous cases or law cases that we're bringing into Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. We have won, and we have participated in winning a lot of emblematic cases like the Waiastingi in Nicaragua, the Panará in Brazil, and the Saramaka case in Suriname. Currently, the Hunan collective lands in Panama, the two first ones out of the 27 that have been demarcated in June of this year. Actually, Rachel was there for the ceremony of when they were giving the land titling to them. It's a very important recent victory that we have had. And also a lot of important thing that we do is support indigenous peoples to get university degrees. For example, in Guyana, the only indigenous lawyer that exists because we set up a fund for him to go study law in Trinidad and Tobago. So it's very important to have that. It's not mostly what we do, but in some kind of key issues, we think that's an important thing to invest. A lot of our partners have been recognized internationally, not only by us, by different kind of environmental prizes or environmental justice prizes. So Jean LaRose from APA in Guyana and Joania Wapchana from Brazil is just two examples of them. We have worked with different indigenous groups in Peru and other places, and there are some victories, as I said, in terms of logging, and I'm talking more collectively, the successes, not only from Rainforest Foundation US, and recently also was an access to a health project in Peru, which is not much what we do, but it was a community that had a really, really high incidence of hepatitis B, and it was actually in the verge of extinction because everyone is just dying at the age of 30 years old. And because of that, because the government did not provide health care to these people, they were selling their fish and their logs in order to be able to pay for private care. So even though it was not something directly related to forest conservation per se, we thought it was pretty linked. And I think I'd like to just to finish, talking about some of the practical aspects, some of the challenges we find, and I'm talking about the challenge from the practical side of view, from the philosophical and other things. From the practical point of view, I don't know how many people here have worked with indigenous peoples, but it's a very rewarding but a very intense and in long-term relationship. The whole thing about building trust and confidence is something that happens over time. And I believe for that you have to be completely respectful, be a good listener, and be very flexible. And that's something that our projects are a lot, is flexible in terms of they want to change some of the outcomes in the middle of it because the context just changed. A very important challenge is how you then perceive as a partner, as someone that's there to help and not just a bank that is just lending them money and giving money. It's something really difficult and important. And there are disagreements within the same community. Our whole romantic ideas about communities holding hands and doing everything together it doesn't exist on the ground. And also it doesn't exist in the same ethnic group. It doesn't exist when you work in umbrella organizations that you have different and conflicting ethnic groups working there. One thing very important, you never become involved in the kind of disagreements that they have. It's a challenge because we work with several groups that conflict with each other, but we try not to get involved. And we also work with a lot of nascent organizations that have never received a funding before, have no idea how to write a report, how to do accountability for the funds that they spent. And another thing that's very important to think about it is, and I was talking to Liz too, is the issues of representation. Who is the legitimate voice of indigenous peoples? Who represent indigenous peoples? Leadership and the changes and the dynamic aspects that leadership and representation can take. You can be working with one kind of set of group of people that are the leaders of that organization, then they have a new elections and everyone changes. Then you kind of sometimes have to start from scratch again. And then, as I said, securing funds for long-term processes. There is some very important political challenges in working with this kind of issue. And land rights is probably one of the most important ones because when you're trying to push for indigenous land demarcation, you're really questioning the status quo in terms of land tenure system. In the context of RED, I mean, although RED is doing a lot of interesting and positive things for indigenous peoples and getting their recognition as important stakeholder, or we like to say rights holder, in this process, in many governments can see like setting aside land for indigenous peoples might mean that we as government will receive less funding because of carbon content that those territories could have. And then FPIC and participation in economic activities are very challenged because there's, especially in terms of oil exploration, I can go over that later. And then there's some philosophical aspects to that, and there's a huge push, as I said, from the donor community to ask for measurable outcomes. And especially short term, they give you a grant for 2-3 years and expect you to change the world. And a lot of the processes we do are social processes that take time and depending on the outcomes, and so it's kind of hard sometimes to measure your outcome if you're trying. And also something that's not here is in a lot of our supports, the ultimate voice in the decision-making process, you like it or not, is the government. At the end, it's the government who issued the land titling. It's the government who actually ended up doing the RED strategy with or without input of indigenous peoples. So a lot of the ultimate result or the outcome that we want to get not necessarily in our hands. And I think what I would like you to take home from all this is that we totally believe that indigenous peoples are the part of the solution in terms of forest protection. They are not the drivers of deforestation. The whole idea about human rights and indigenous rights should be interwoven in the whole aspects of any kind of organization in terms of setting program agendas, implementation, and it's just not the right thing to do. It's not only the right thing to do, but it also works, and I showed you a little bit of that. And to end, I just would like to say that a lot of you might not even go to the rainforest. I don't know what kind of background you have, or even working with indigenous peoples, and you're kind of like, oh, what can I do? Rachel said a very good example in kind of coming and volunteer with us. I have to say, she set the bar very high, but we really would welcome any ideas about, or we haven't set up yet our internships for the next summer, but we would love to have some of you applying if you feel that the kind of work that we do resonates with you and with your heart. Something that we can talk later, and we're going to be posting this in the future. I don't have anything in my mind right now, but it's something that you could be involved. I mean, there are different things you can do. You can donate money, which is a pretty obvious one, but you can also spread the word and talk about it. There's a lot of information on our newsletter, Facebook, and Twitter. You guys all have PhDs on this, more than me for sure. And we also we have field-based internships, but we also have office internships for people who are more interested in having other kind of experience. Also engaging, and if you sign up for newsletters and Facebook and Twitter, we're also going to do kind of call to action. We very often have fundraising campaigns. If there are any undergrads or people who is interested in do a Rock for the Rainforest concert or Live Below the Line, which is, we can talk about that later, is a way of fundraising that we have developed in partnership with other organizations where people pay us. They say a lot of people in the world live with $1.50 a day. So in May for 5 days, we had the whole staff and lots of other people around the world, not just us, living with $1.50 a day. And we can talk about how this experience is. And instead of running a marathon and asking people to pay you, we ask people to pay us to live below the poverty line and kind of report and feel like what that feels like. Not necessarily saying that indigenous peoples are poor, but when you have a lot of those processes in terms of not having their land demarcated or a lot of these development interventions, they're pushed aside from their land and they're like then forced into poverty, not that they're poor. By no means. I think it's an important issue. And later, I just need Jack to show as a 3-minute our video, which is very soon. I think then we open for questions if you still have any energy for that. I certainly do. Oh, how you going?
It'll come back, don't worry.
I trust you.
Or maybe not. Wait 1 second.
it just says it has to be outside.
Yeah, it's a pain in the ass.
That's Colleen, the indigenous Kayapó that I mentioned, the leader.